Nobody in the history of Providence had ever slapped Damian Cross and lived to tell the story with both hands still attached. Nobody, until the afternoon a pediatric nurse named Claire Bennett crossed a hospital hallway, grabbed a screaming 6-year-old out of the arms of two of his men, and struck the most feared man in New England across the face in front of 11 witnesses. What none of them expected, least of all Damian himself, was that he would raise a hand not to strike back, but to silence the room, and give an order that would end his men's careers before it ended anyone's life. "Leave us," he said. "All of you." And in the sudden, terrified silence that followed, Claire Bennett understood that she had just done something no one in this city had dared to do in 15 years, and somehow, impossibly, survived it. The trouble had started 20 minutes earlier, in the pediatric wing of St. Anne's, where Claire had worked nights for 6 years and had learned, the hard way, exactly which kinds of men to fear and exactly which kinds to simply manage. She had not expected to fear the man who walked through the automatic doors just after midnight, flanked by two others in dark coats, carrying a sobbing little girl who could not have been more than 6 years old. "She needs a doctor," the man said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Something in the flat certainty of his tone moved the entire nurses' station into motion before Claire had even processed the words. The girl's name, Claire learned in the chaos of the next few minutes, was Nina. A fever spiking fast, a rash spreading up one arm that made the on-call physician's face go tight and careful in a way Claire recognized as genuine concern rather than routine caution. What Claire did not understand, not yet, was why the two men flanking Damian Cross kept trying to physically separate Nina from her hospital bed the moment the fever broke enough for her to sit up and cry for someone named Uncle Sal, and why Damian himself stood back and let them. "She needs to stay calm," Claire said, stepping between one of the men and the child's bed for the second time in 10 minutes. "You're making this worse." "This isn't your concern," the larger of the two men said, reaching past her. "It's exactly my concern," Claire said. "She's my patient." The second attempt came faster, rougher, the man's hand closing around Nina's small wrist hard enough that the child screamed. A real scream, pain layered over fear. And something in Claire that had spent 6 years learning patience with difficult families simply ran out. She crossed the small space in 2 steps, wrenched the man's hand off the girl's wrist with more strength than her frame suggested she had, and turned on the only person in the room who looked like he might actually be in charge. Damian Cross was standing near the window, arms crossed, watching the scene with an expression Claire would later struggle to name. Not quite indifference, but something colder, more contained, like a man watching whether he had already decided not to interfere with. "Do something," Claire snapped at him. "Your men are hurting a sick child, and you're just standing there." Something flickered across his face, surprise, maybe, at being addressed at all in that tone, and he said nothing, which was, in Claire's exhausted, furious estimation, exactly the wrong answer. Her hand moved before her mind fully caught up to it. The slap landed clean across his jaw, sharp enough that the sound of it seemed to suck all the air out of the room. Every nurse at the station froze. One of the men reached instinctively for something beneath his coat before catching himself. Nina, startled into silence, stared at Claire with wide, tear-streaked eyes. Claire's own heart was slamming so hard she could barely hear herself think, some distant, horrified part of her already cataloging every possible consequence of what she'd just done. Standing this close to a man whose bearing, whose stillness, whose 2 armed companions told her exactly what kind of world he belonged to. Damian Cross did not move for a long moment. His jaw was reddening slowly where her palm had struck him. His eyes, when they finally settled back on her, held something unreadable, not rage, not yet, but a kind of recalibration, as though he were seeing the room and her for the first time. Then he raised one hand, palm out, toward his own men. "Leave us," he said quietly. "All of you." Nobody moved for exactly 1 second. Then, one by one, the 2 men, the second shift security guard who had come running at the commotion, even the charge nurse hovering anxiously near the desk, all of them filed out of the room, leaving Claire standing alone in front of a Mafia boss with a red mark blooming across his face, a frightened child clutching the hem of her scrubs, and absolutely no idea what was about to happen next. The door clicked shut, and for a long moment, the only sound in the room was Nina's small, hitching breaths and the distant beep of a monitor down the hall. Claire did not apologize. She had already decided, somewhere in the 3 seconds it took the room to empty, that whatever came next, She was not going to open with an apology for protecting a child. Instead, she planted herself between Damian Cross and the hospital bed, arms crossed, chin lifted, waiting. Damian studied her for a long moment, one hand coming up briefly to touch his own jaw, almost absently, as though confirming for himself that the mark was real. "You understand," he said finally, his voice quiet, controlled, "that no one has done that to me in 15 years. "I understand your men were hurting a sick child," Claire said. "That's the part one care about." Something in his expression shifted, not anger, she realized with some surprise, but a kind of careful, unfamiliar attention, as though he were recalculating something about the room entirely. "They weren't trying to hurt her," he said. "They were trying to get her away from the window." Claire frowned. The window. Damian glanced toward the pediatric room's single window, curtained now, facing the hospital's side parking lot. "Nina's father was killed 6 days ago," he said. "Not an accident. A message meant for me, delivered through someone I was supposed to protect. She's been staying with people I trust ever since, and tonight, for reasons I still don't fully understand, someone found out where." Claire's arms slowly uncrossed. "Found out where a sick 6-year-old was being kept." "Yes." "And your men were trying to move her away from a window because if the wrong person can see her silhouette against that curtain," Damian said, "she becomes a much easier target than she is standing in the middle of a room." The color drained slowly from Claire's face as the full weight of what she'd interrupted began to settle. She looked down at Nina, who had gone quiet, watching the two adults with a wide, exhausted stillness of a child who had already learned, this week, that grown-ups arguing sometimes meant something bad was about to happen. "Why didn't you just say that?" Claire said, quieter now. "Because explaining that a rival organization might be targeting a child for assassination isn't typically how I introduce myself in a hospital hallway," Damian said, and something in his tone, dry and exact, almost sounded like it wanted to be humor, though his face gave away nothing at all. Claire sat down slowly on the edge of the visitor's chair, the adrenaline that had carried her through the last 10 minutes draining out of her all at once, leaving something shakier behind it. "I slapped you," she said, mostly to herself, "because I thought you were letting your men manhandle a frightened kid." "You slapped me," Damian corrected, "because you thought a child was in danger from the adults meant to protect her, and you were the only person in that room willing to do something about it." He paused. "That's not something I intend to punish, Ems." "Bennett. Claire Bennett." "Ems. Bennett," he said. "In my experience, most people freeze around men like me." "You didn't." Claire looked up at him, still wary despite the strange, careful courtesy in his voice. "That's supposed to reassure me." "No," Damian said honestly. "I don't imagine anything about tonight reassures you. But it should tell you that whatever you're afraid I'm going to do to you for what just happened, it isn't that." Nina shifted on the bed, one small hand reaching out toward Claire's sleeve, an instinctive gesture toward the only adult in the room who had, in the last hour, actually knelt down to her level and spoken to her gently instead of over her head. "Is the fever medicine going to make me sleepy?" Nina asked, her voice small and rough from crying. "A little," Claire said, softening instantly, the careful professional warmth returning to her voice the moment the child needed it. "That's a good thing, sweetheart. Your body needs the rest to fight off whatever's making you sick." Damian watched the exchange in silence, something unreadable moving behind his eyes as Claire adjusted the child's blanket, checked the monitor without needing to be asked, murmured something reassuring that made Nina's small shoulders finally, visibly relax. "You're good with her," he said quietly, once Nina's eyes had drifted half-closed. "It's my job." "It's more than your job," Damian said. "I've watched a dozen nurses handle frightened children tonight. None of them looked at her the way you just did." Claire glanced up at him, unsure what to do with the sudden, unguarded honesty in his voice. So at odds with the cold, contained man who had stood silent while his men manhandled a child 10 minutes earlier. Before she could answer, a soft knock sounded at the door, hesitant, apologetic, and one of the men from the hallway leaned in, his face pale in a way that told Damian, before a single word was spoken, that whatever news he carried was not going to make this night any simpler. "Boss," the man said quietly, "you need to see this. It's about who called in the location." Damian stepped into the hallway, and Claire, against every instinct telling her to stay put and mind her own business, found herself drifting close enough to the door to hear. "Security footage from the parking lot," the man said, holding up a tablet. Camera caught a car circling the block 3 times in the last hour before it finally parked. We ran the plate. And it's registered to Marco Belfiore. Damian went very still. Claire, watching through the narrow gap in the doorway, saw something pass across his face that she hadn't seen yet that night. Not the cold control of a man managing a crisis, but something colder still, older, personal. Marco Belfiore doesn't drive his own car to a job, Damian said quietly. He sends someone else, which means either he wanted to be seen tonight, or he made a mistake he doesn't usually make. There's more, the man said, lowering his voice further. The nurse who logged Nina's admission under her real name instead of the alias we gave the front desk. She made a phone call 20 minutes after intake. We're pulling the number now, but boss, I think we have a leak inside the hospital, not just outside it. Claire's stomach dropped. She thought immediately of Denise, the charge nurse who'd been unusually curious about the VIP family bringing in a sick child at midnight, who had asked twice for the girl's full legal name for the chart. She pushed the door open before she'd fully decided to. Denise, Claire said. That charge nurse. She asked for Nina's real name at intake. I thought it was just paperwork. Damian's eyes cut to her sharply. You're certain? I filled out the admission form myself. Denise came back twice asking me to double-check the spelling of the surname you gave us, which wasn't the one I'd written down originally. Claire's hands had gone cold. I thought she was just being thorough. Damian turned to his man. Find her. Now. Quietly. I don't want a scene in a hospital full of witnesses, but I want to know who she called and how long ago she left the building. The man disappeared down the hall at a fast, controlled walk that somehow drew less attention than running would have. Claire stood in the doorway, arms wrapped around herself. The adrenaline of the slap long since curdled into something closer to dread. This is real, she said quietly. Someone actually wants to hurt that little girl. Yes, Damian said, no softening in his voice at all now. No attempt to make it easier to hear. And now they know exactly which room she's in. Then move her. To where? Damian said. Every safe house I have was chosen because Marco didn't know about it. If he's already found this one, I have to assume at least 2 others are compromised too. Moving her blind is more dangerous than staying put with enough men to hold this floor. Claire looked back through the doorway at Nina, asleep now, the fever finally breaking into an easier, more even breathing, utterly unaware that her location had just become a battlefield. She can't stay in a hospital wing with armed men storming through it, Claire said. There are other children on this floor. Something in Damian's expression tightened, as though the thought had already occurred to him and he didn't like where it led either. I know, he said. Then what's the plan? Damian looked at her for a long moment, something calculating behind his eyes that made Claire distinctly uneasy, before he said, I need you to keep doing exactly what you were doing an hour ago. Take care of her. Act like nothing has changed. If Marco's people are watching this hallway right now, the last thing I want them to see is panic. You want me to babysit while you handle whatever this actually is. I want you, Damian said, to be the reason this child doesn't spend what might be the most frightening night of her life staring at armed men instead of a nurse who actually looks at her like she matters. Claire opened her mouth to argue, some instinct telling her this was exactly the kind of involvement a sensible person walked away from immediately and found, instead, that she was already nodding. Fine, she said. But you don't get to keep me in the dark the way you kept your own men out of that room. If something's about to happen on my floor, I want to know before it does. Something shifted in Damian's face, not quite a smile, but close enough to one that Claire noticed it, the particular, surprised respect of a man unused to being given terms by anyone at all. Agreed, he said. Neither of them noticed, in that moment, the elevator at the far end of the hall chimed softly and opened onto 2 men in maintenance uniforms who did not belong to the hospital's overnight staff, who stepped out with the unhurried, deliberate calm of men who had done this exact walk before and turned, without hesitation, toward the pediatric wing. Damian's man spotted the 2 maintenance uniforms before they'd made it 15 feet down the corridor. Boss. The voice came low through the earpiece Damian had slipped on the moment he'd learned about the leak location. East elevator. 2 men, wrong shift, wrong badges. Moving toward pediatrics. Damian's whole posture changed in an instant, not frantic, not visibly alarmed, but recalibrated. The way a man shifts his weight before a fight he's already decided he's going to win. Claire, he said quietly, turning back toward the room. I need you to get Nina into the bathroom, lock the door, and stay there until I come for you myself. Not until someone tells you it's safe. Until I come for you. What's happening? Now, Claire. Something in his voice, flat, absolute, carrying none of the careful courtesy from 10 minutes earlier, moved her faster than any explanation could have. She scooped Nina up, blanket and all, the girl stirring into groggy, frightened wakefulness at the sudden motion, and got them both into the small adjoining bathroom before the first shout echoed down the hallway. Through the door, muffled but unmistakable, she heard it begin. Not gunfire, not yet, but the fast, controlled chaos of men moving into position, low voices giving orders, the distinct, heavy sound of a body hitting a wall. Nina's small hands gripped Claire's scrub top hard enough to hurt. Is it the bad men? She whispered. The ones from before. I don't know, sweetheart, Claire said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage while her own heart hammered against her ribs. But we're going to stay right here and be very quiet, okay? Like a game. I don't like this game, Nina whispered. Neither do I, Claire admitted. But we're going to be brave together. Outside, the confrontation lasted less than 90 seconds, a fact Claire would only learn later. Because inside the small tiled bathroom, every second stretched impossibly long. She heard Damian's voice once, low and hard, cutting through the commotion with the same absolute authority she'd first heard him use to clear the room hours earlier. She heard something crash. She heard a single controlled scuffle, quickly ended. And then, worst of all, a silence that seemed to last far longer than the noise had. The bathroom door handle turned. Claire pressed Nina behind her instinctively, already calculating, absurdly, what exactly a hospital nurse could do against an armed intruder with nothing but her bare hands and 6 years of pediatric training. It's me, Damian said through the door. It's over. You're both safe. Claire opened the door slowly and found him standing in the doorway, a thin line of blood at his temple. His jacket torn at one shoulder, but upright, controlled, alive. Behind him, down the hallway, she caught a glimpse of his men securing 2 unconscious figures in stolen maintenance uniforms. A hospital security guard hovering nearby with a phone pressed to his ear, clearly being talked through exactly what version of events to report. Are you hurt? Claire said, the question out before she decided to ask it. Some instinct older than caution moving her forward to check the cut at his temple before he could answer. It's nothing, Damian said, though he didn't step back from her hands as she tilted his head gently to check the wound properly. The professional habit of 6 years overriding the fear still coursing through her. It needs a butterfly bandage at minimum, she said. Sit down, Claire. Sit down, she repeated, and something in her voice, steady despite everything, made him actually do it. Lowering himself onto the edge of Nina's hospital bed while Claire retrieved a first aid kit from the supply cart with hands that had only just stopped shaking. Nina, watching from the doorway, small and pale but no longer crying, said quietly, You came back. Like you said. Damian looked at the child for a long moment, something in his controlled expression finally visibly cracking. I told you I would. Uncle Sal always says that too, Nina said. But sometimes he doesn't. Something moved across Damian's face. Grief, Claire realized, watching him carefully as she cleaned the cut at his temple. Grief for a man named Sal who had apparently made this same promise to Nina before, and hadn't lived to see it through the way Damian just had. I'll always come back, Damian said quietly, meeting the child's eyes with a seriousness that made the promise land differently than the reassurances adults usually offered frightened children. As long as I'm breathing, Nina, I will always come back for you. Claire, taping the last of the bandage into place, found herself watching him with something she hadn't expected to feel toward this man at all. Not fear anymore. Not even simple gratitude, but something warmer and far more complicated, the beginning of an understanding that the coldest, most feared man in the city had just made a 6-year-old orphan a promise he clearly intended to keep with his own life if it came to that. Who was Sal? Claire asked quietly, once Nina had drifted, exhausted, back into sleep against the pillows. Damian was quiet a long moment before he answered. Her father, he said. My best friend since we were 14 years old. The man Marco Belfiore had killed 6 days ago to send me a message. His jaw tightened. And the reason I am not going to let anything happen to his daughter, no matter what it costs me. The 2 men in stolen uniforms were gone by the time the sun came up, handed over. Claire understood without being told the details, to a fate she decided she'd rather not ask about. What remained was a hospital wing quietly returning to its ordinary rhythms, a sleeping child finally breathing easy, and Damian Cross sitting in a plastic visitor's chair he clearly wasn't built for, looking like a man who hadn't slept in longer than one night. Claire brought him coffee from the nurse's break room without really deciding to. It felt, somehow, like the least strange thing that had happened all night. "You didn't have to do that," he said, taking the cup. "You didn't have to let your men leave the room instead of retaliating when I slapped you," Claire said, settling into the chair across from him. "I think we're past keeping score." Something that might almost have been a smile touched the corner of his mouth. Fair enough. For a while, they sat in comfortable silence, watching Nina sleep, the machines around her beeping their steady, reassuring rhythm. It was Claire who finally broke it. "What happens to her now?" she asked. "If Marco already found one safe house, what's stopping him from finding the next one?" Damian's jaw tightened. "Nothing, if I keep hiding her the same way. Which is why I'm not going to." Claire frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning I'm done playing defense," Damian said. "Sal died protecting information he never should have had to carry alone. Marco's been circling this territory for a year, testing how far he can push before I push back. Tonight he crossed the one line I was never going to let him cross." He looked at Nina, still sleeping, small and impossibly innocent against the hospital pillows. "He's going to learn exactly why that was a mistake." "That sounds like a war," Claire said quietly. "It is one," Damian said. "It has been for longer than tonight. I've just been trying to keep her out of it." Claire studied him for a long moment. This man who, 12 hours ago, she had believed capable of standing by while his men hurt a child, and who had since revealed himself to be something far more complicated. Dangerous, certainly, but carrying a code she hadn't expected, a grief he clearly hadn't finished processing, and a fierce, uncomplicated devotion to a little girl who wasn't his blood at all. "Why does it matter to you this much?" she asked. "Not the war. Why does a 6-year-old matter this much to a man like you?" Damian was quiet long enough that Claire thought he might not answer at all. "Sal pulled me out of a burning building when I was 14, he said finally. "My father's enemies had decided to make a point that year. Sal wasn't even supposed to be there. He just was, and he didn't think twice." He turned the coffee cup slowly in his hands. "I've spent 20 years trying to be the kind of man who pays that back properly, and the truth is you can't. Not really. All you can do is make sure the people he loved don't pay the price for the life he chose." "That's not nothing," Claire said quietly. "It's not enough either," Damian said. "And not if I lose her the way I lost him." Before Claire could answer, his phone buzzed against the chair arm, a message, brief. And something in his face changed the instant he read it. "Marco's requested a meeting," he said slowly. "Tonight. Neutral ground. He says he wants to discuss terms." "You don't believe him?" "I believe," Damian said, "that a man who sends 2 people to grab a sleeping child out of a hospital bed at midnight doesn't suddenly want to discuss terms 12 hours later. Unless he's already lost more than he expected to tonight and needs a way to save face." He set the phone down. "Which means this meeting isn't really about terms. It's about finding out exactly how far I'll go to protect her, so he knows exactly what leverage he still has left." Claire's stomach tightened. "And if you go?" "Then I make it very clear," Damian said, "that there isn't any leverage left to find. That whatever this was before tonight, territory, respect, business, it's not what this is anymore." He looked at her, something steady and unflinching in his gaze despite the weight clearly sitting behind it. "It's just her now, and I will burn down everything I've built before I let anyone use her against me again." Claire, sitting across from a man who 12 hours ago had been a stranger she'd struck across the face in a hallway, found she believed him completely, and found, more unsettling still, that some part of her had already decided she wasn't going to let him walk into that meeting alone. The meeting was set for an abandoned pier warehouse on the edge of Providence Harbor, chosen, Damian told her, because it was the one piece of ground neither family had ever fully claimed as their own. Claire was not supposed to be there. She had said so herself, twice, standing in the hospital corridor while Damian argued with Marcus about security details. And both times Damian had told her, firmly, to stay with Nina. She had gone anyway, in the back seat of a car she'd insisted on, arriving 20 minutes after Damian and refusing to be turned away by the 2 men posted at the warehouse door, because some stubborn, unshakable instinct told her that whatever happened tonight, someone needed to be there who wasn't already committed to a war. She arrived in time to hear Marco Belfiore's voice carrying across the empty warehouse floor, amused, unhurried. The voice of a man who still believed he held every card that mattered. Damian Cross, Marco said, flanked by 3 of his own men. I have to admit, I didn't expect you to actually come. You said you wanted to discuss terms, Damian said. I did. Marco's smile was easy practiced. I'm prepared to let this go, Damian. All of it. Sal's debt, the girl, the whole unfortunate business, if you're willing to hand over the bellwether shipping contracts by the end of the month. Consider it a peace offering. I'll even let you keep your dignity. You killed my best friend to send a message, Damian said, his voice utterly level. And now you're asking me to reward you for it. I'm asking you to be practical, Marco said. Sal chose his side a long time ago. He knew the risks. The girl is just. Don't, Damian said, and something in the single word cut through the warehouse air sharper than any shout could have. Don't finish that sentence, Marco. I came here tonight to give you exactly one chance to walk away from this permanently. Not because I'm afraid of what happens if you don't. Because I want you to understand clearly what happens after. Marco's smile faltered, just slightly. You're threatening me over a child who isn't even yours. She's mine, Damian said, and Claire, standing in the shadows near the entrance where she'd promised herself she'd only watch, felt something in her chest tighten at the raw, unshakable certainty in his voice. And not by blood. By every choice I've made since the night her father pulled me out of a fire. That makes her mine in every way that's ever mattered to me. And it means anyone who comes near her again answers to me directly, with everything I have. For a long moment, the 2 men stared at each other across the warehouse floor, and Claire understood, watching from the shadows, that this was not a negotiation at all. It was Damian giving Marco one last, genuine chance to survive a decision he had already made. Marco's hand moved toward his coat. It was the last mistake he made. Damian's men moved before Marco's fingers had fully closed around whatever waited beneath the fabric, fast and controlled and utterly without hesitation. And within seconds the confrontation was over. Not with the drawn-out violence Claire had braced herself for, but with the swift, decisive finality of men who had trained for exactly this moment and refused to let it become anything messier than necessary. Marco Belfiore did not walk out of that warehouse. His men, disarmed and given a choice that Claire understood, without needing it explained, was more mercy than they likely expected did. Damian crossed the warehouse floor afterward and found Claire exactly where she'd hoped he wouldn't, standing near the entrance, pale but steady, having watched the entire thing unfold. You were supposed to stay with her, he said, though there was no real anger in it, only exhaustion and something gentler underneath. She's asleep and Marcus's men are watching the room, Claire said. I didn't want you walking into this alone. Damian looked at her for a long moment, rain-damp and unafraid despite everything she'd just witnessed, and something in his careful, controlled composure finally, visibly gave way. Nobody has ever done that for me, he said quietly. Stood somewhere dangerous just so I wouldn't be alone in it. Maybe nobody around you ever wanted to before, Claire said. 6 weeks later, Nina started first grade at a school 2 towns over, under a new name Damian's people had built for her with quiet, careful thoroughness. Though she still called him Uncle Damian every evening when he came to pick her up from the small house where Claire had, somewhat to her own surprise, moved in to help raise a little girl neither of them had planned on loving quite this much. On a warm evening in early autumn, Damian found Claire on the back porch, watching Nina chase fireflies across the yard, and settled beside her without a word. The practiced stillness of a dangerous man who had, somewhere in the last 6 weeks, learned an entirely different kind of quiet. I keep thinking about that slap, he said eventually. Regretting it? No, Damian said. Grateful for it. It's the only reason any of this happened at all. Claire looked at him. This man the whole city still feared, who had once stood cold and silent while she fought for a frightened child, who had since rebuilt an entire war around the promise of protecting her, and reached for his hand the way she had, without quite meaning to. On the very first night this all began. Then I suppose, she said, I'd slap you again if it meant landing here. Some storms end in ruin. This one ended in a porch light, a child's laughter chasing fireflies, and 2 people who had found, in the middle of the worst night of their lives, exactly the family neither of them had known they were looking for. If this story moved you, hit like, subscribe for more emotional Mafia romance stories. and share it with someone who believes courage can start with something as simple as standing up for a child. Would you have had the courage to slap the most feared man in the city to protect that little girl?